Okay. Hi, everyone that's jumping in from the waiting room right now. Thank you for joining us. I know sometimes it takes a couple seconds to get in here, but thank you so much for being here. Let's see here. All
Hey
right.
guys.
Um, so we'll see. I know some people are filtering in now. So my name is Bernadette Smith. I'm also here with Ashley Jones tonight. You are joining us for a digital SAT versus the new ACT webinar. So not that you went through enough last year with them changing the SAT. So this year they decided to change the ACT, and we are here to go through the details of that with you, answer questions that you might have. I will certainly be deferring to Ashley's expertise on both tests as we go through this, but I am here to answer questions. I'll be manning some of the questions in the Q&A as we go through this tonight and just be here generally as a resource. And I will be the one sending you all the information afterwards and the recording and all that good stuff. But as I mentioned, tonight is our digital SAT versus new ACT webinar. Couple of little things. You'll see the chat is disabled, but the Q&A is wide open. So feel free to throw questions in that. Everybody will receive the recording after this, so no worries if you miss a slide or something you want to repeat later on, you will get that from us. And any important links or graphics that we share that you need, we are happy to share those, and we'll be putting some things in the chat as we go throughout tonight's presentation. All right. And then just a couple few things before we start. One thing at the end of this, we always like to thank people for participating in our webinars. So we will have a special promotion for all of you at the end of tonight's webinar. It includes some free sessions, good time to get started with some spring test prep or getting ready for AP exams or just the chaos of the end of the school year. And then one other new thing that we have is we are allowing students to bundle their ACT and SAT experience. And this is just a chance for in a given month, a student to be able to take an April 5th mock SAT and then an April 26th mock ACT, which is reflective of the new test that we'll be describing to you tonight. So for those of you that may be on the fence about which test is best for you, this is a great chance that in a short time frame, but not so back to back where it's stressful, you can take both tests. It's at a reduced price. I'll be getting that information to all of you. And it's a chance to then meet with one of us on our academic advising team to decide if that test makes best sense for you, if they're kind of even, which we often see in the conversion chart between scores, and just get a sense for your child about which test they felt more comfortable with, especially with the new test. That's, not something you want to necessarily go into blind. So getting an experience with it. Our new enhanced ACT reflects the new one that the ACT is putting out next month. So you'll have that opportunity with us. But that is all the housekeeping stuff on our end. I will turn it over to Ashley now, but you'll see me in the chat and I'll be here for questions. But for now, off to you, Ashley. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. All right. So a little bit about me, just to kind of get us started. Um, I honestly, the most important part is that I have been working as a tutor slash coach for the last like 10 plus years, as painful as that is for me to say. I've got a lot of experience in test prep, both with SAT and ACT. So I've seen a lot of the changes, not only with the digital SAT that was just implemented last year, that transition from the paper to the digital test. And now, as Bernadette was mentioning, here we are a year later, and we're now dealing with the same thing with the new ACT and handling some of those changes. So I've seen these things in real time, and I'm constantly working with students, both in a one-on-one format and with some of the boot camps that we do here at Novastar. So I see these exams all the time, and I'll do my best kind of as we go through to point out really just some of the big items that I would want parents and students to know about the test, and kind of choosing which one is really going to be best for them and really highlight their strengths as they're applying for colleges. And my background is a little bit in STEM, not a little bit, a lot of it maybe, but it is in STEM. And so I will kind of talk about some differences with the ACT, specifically with the science section, and some of those changes that came up with the new digital offering as of April, coming up in 1 month. So I'll go over that a little bit too, and how to kind of support students who do have maybe a stronger background in STEM. So in terms of kind of what we're going to be focusing on tonight, we're going to start off with the overview of the digital SAT. So that overview, these changes are already in place. They've been in place for the last year. So you might already be a little bit familiar with some of those, some of these points with the SAT, because maybe your student is already kind of maybe in the middle of, or, getting prepared for test prep, and you might already know some of it. But then we'll also go over the introduction to the new ACT, which again, coming up in just a month with all of those changes. So it's very new, hot off the press, if you will. And then we'll kind of go over a test comparison, really just to help give you a better idea of what test is going to be ultimately the best for your student to take. So one thing that I want to mention, and I get this question a lot, maybe from students who are kind of sitting there like, oh, I don't want to take the SAT or the ACT, why am I doing this? And I cannot tell you how many times they've asked me just personally, like, what do you think of the SAT? Is this even worth it? And all those fun questions that students are going to ask. But standardized testing is definitely not going anywhere. Even though it might seem frustrating for some students to have to take the standardized tests, it definitely can serve as a great tool to get into college. And so if a student does submit their test scores, whether it be the ACT, the SAT, that is definitely going to give them a competitive edge when they start applying to schools. And test optional schools is nothing new. I mean, even when I applied to undergrad 10 plus years ago, the school that I ended up going to was also test optional. So this is nothing new, but still submitted my test scores because, and it did ultimately help me with scholarships. I believe that it helped me also kind of just get into the program that I was getting into because they saw that score was good and like, okay, it just added a little bit extra to my application. So it's definitely not going anywhere. It's still a great idea to submit test scores. Like I mentioned, definitely can be helpful for a number of scholarships. And then there are some test required schools. The vast majority of colleges are going to be test optional, and that's fine. But some individual schools have actually returned to requiring test scores for admissions, even if they took maybe a little bit of a break from that during the pandemic or whatnot. There are some schools who, definitely are going to be test required. And if you're curious about, what schools could be, fall under what category, like I mentioned, a majority of them are going to be test optional, but I would definitely encourage if your student is looking or interested in a particular school or program, just do some research and kind of see if they are in fact test required, just to kind of get a good idea. But again, majority of them test optional, but I would highly encourage students to actually take and submit their test scores. Digital SAT, it has been around now for the past year. And there are some changes. Again, you guys might be somewhat familiar with this, but the exam was originally offered on paper. Now we've got this digital format. And so there were a few things, we're going to get into the details about what was actually changed. Overall, it has been easier to take, a little bit easier to give the tests, like for different administrators. Also a little bit more relevant in terms of they're focused more so on real world applications with a lot of these questions, especially for the math. I always joke it's no longer, hey, Johnny ate 200 cookies and if you didn't finish this, like it's not like outlandish random scenarios. They're very much real world applications. And so that's going to help students as they start to prepare for college, especially when students are taking, gen ed courses. And, you see in the verbal section on the SAT, there are a number of passages, whether it be science related, social science related, etc. So it kind of gives the students a good idea for what they're going to experience, not just within their own particular major that they might be interested in, but also to cover some of those gen ed courses that they will most likely take as well. One of the biggest changes with the digital exam as compared to the paper exam, aside from the fact that now it's on a computer and not just, not on paper anymore, is the fact that it's adaptive. And it's adaptive by section, not by question. I know that there are some other exams in grad school and whatnot and beyond that are kind of adaptive by question. And in the SAT is not adaptive by question. It's adaptive by module. Again, I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a moment here. Previously, reading and writing were two separate sections on the paper exam. Now they're combined in one. So the students are being tested not just on reading concepts like central ideas and details, command of evidence, but they're also being tested on some of the standard English conventions, the grammar concepts are basically all kind of in one verbal section now. Math does have additional features as well. Again, we'll go over that in just a sec, but the test length, this is probably one of the things that was that students were very excited about for sure, was that the test is actually shorter now. They were there for a little bit longer, so they shaved off a little bit of the time. So it's not taking as much time for students to get through the test. Now, I did discuss a little bit about this adaptive scoring. So the way the SAT is currently broken down or broken apart is we've got 2 modules for the verbal section, and then there are 2 modules for the math section. And so when a student is testing in module 1 of either section, there's going to be a mix of questions in terms of difficulty. Some of them are going to be easy. Some of them are going to be kind of a medium level difficulty. And some of them are just going to be, difficult questions. And depending on how that student scores in module 1, they're going to test into either an easy or a hard module 2. It might seem like punishment at first, your student does well in module 1, and then you're rewarded with really hard questions in module 2. Might not seem like the best trade-off there, but it is good for them to get into that hard module 2, because that's going to actually increase their score ceiling. So if a student were to test into module 2 easy for either verbal or math, their score ceiling is going to be a little bit lower than if they were to test into a hard module 2. Okay, so always want to make sure, of course, students want to do as well as they can on every section of the SAT, but that first module is super important to do well so that you can set yourself up for success in that second module. Hopefully get to that hard module 2, be able to answer more challenging questions, and ultimately see a better return in terms of scoring. Okay. Here's just kind of an example. This student would have tested into module 2 easy. They only received 1 hard question, so it would have capped off that score. So it just kind of gives you a little bit of an example as what this actually looks like. Now, so we've talked a little bit about the module 1, module 2 for both of these. In terms of actual structure and timing, I do want to highlight that there is a break. That's always important. There is a break between the verbal and the math modules, but again, it's just going to be a completely adaptive here. One thing that I do want to highlight, which has been a huge help to students, in the paper test, it used to be for math specifically, there used to be a no calculator and a calculator portion of the exam. Now students have access to their calculator for the entire portion of the math exam. So module 1 and module 2, they have access not only to their calculator, but also to Desmos, which is a huge help for a lot of students. So that is also going to be another change that we've seen with the digital test. Okay. Another thing I want to highlight with the verbal portion in terms of the differences. With the paper test, the verbal portions, they were pretty hefty. I'm going to be honest. They covered about a page, sometimes maybe even a little bit longer. and a student would answer questions on one passage. They would usually answer about 10 questions per passage, right? And so that was a lot. And it was also kind of challenging too, because if you're reading a passage, let's say your student kind of struggles with reading the history passages, because a lot of them they will be like primary sources. And so if you're reading a resource from 1700s, 1800s, you've got a lot of what I call old-timey language. It's not always the easiest to break down. And if your student isn't necessarily the strongest in that area, you've now got 10 questions on that one passage. And that's really challenging for students to kind of get through, because that's a good chunk of the question. It's basically fifth of the questions that would be on a very challenging passage that wasn't really their strong suit. And that was challenging, honestly, for a lot of students to kind of overcome and deal with. Now it's a little bit nicer because the excerpts are shorter. So that's awesome. And on top of that, there's only one question per excerpt. Now they are going to be, a mix of different categories like science, social science, etc. But there's only one question per excerpt. So if it's a passage that might be a little bit challenging, it's only one question. They can kind of go to the next one, and maybe the next one will be a little bit easier, or it'll be more up their alley, something that they can kind of handle with maybe a little bit more confidence. As I mentioned, students can now also use a calculator on both portions. Desmos is really what a lot of the students care about. That has been the biggest help, I would say. Of course, I also like to kind of say with a little bit of caution, whenever you have access to more resources for a standardized test, sometimes the questions do get a little bit more challenging. And so, yes, students now have access to Desmos, and that's great. I've seen that help so many people. But not every question can be answered with Desmos. And so some of those questions, like the equivalent expression questions, are going to be a little bit more challenging. So it's a huge thing to definitely be thankful for on the new test, but it doesn't mean that they can kind of just get by with using Desmos on every question. There's still a lot more of the thought process that kind of goes into that, for sure. And like we kind of hinted at this earlier, but yes, the test length is definitely shorter. I mean, they shaved about 40 minutes off of the exam, so that's awesome. We've got about 64 minutes total for the reading and writing, so that's for both modules, not each module. And then math going to be about 70 minutes. So you've got 35 minutes per math module there. And you do have a 10-minute break in between those two, between verbal and math. So it's a nice opportunity for the student just kind of reset for a few minutes and then kind of go right into the math portion of the exam. So again, it's kind of just some of the, basically just to summarize the things that we've kind of been going over. And I do love the fact that if a lot of the questions, especially for math, since they are now based more on real world context, it's super helpful, not only in terms of, definitely does help students in terms of giving them the skills that they're going to need for college or their careers, also helps a little bit when actually answering questions, because even if you're not 100% sure of the appropriate math approach to the question, you can kind of logic your way through it and be like, okay, this is a real world scenario. I can kind of think my way through it, even if I'm not 100% sure of how to set up an equation or something like that. I can think and use those critical thinking skills maybe in a different way than might be expected and still answer that question correctly. So that's definitely a huge help as well. Okay. All right. For the new ACTs, this is coming spring 2025. This is coming next month, so it's just around the corner. Currently, the test is only being offered on paper. That's what has been the case. In April, we are going to see some additional options for digital testing. Now, there's a few changes going on with the ACT. It kind of, to me, almost seems like a little bit of a menu because there's so many options as of right now with the ACT. They are, of course, trying to adapt to technology, just like, the digital SAT was transitioned last year. Now they're trying to kind of make it a little bit easier and more relevant for students as well. And overall, there have been some changes that we're going to kind of get into that will ultimately have, I believe, a more positive impact on students. Things like, it's going to be a little bit of a shorter exam. They've got more options in terms of, what they would like to test on. So we'll kind of get into that as well. Currently, and again, this is before the change in April, the ACT is 2 hours and 55 minutes. So it's a fairly decent amount of time that your student is sitting there taking the exam, even longer if your student has any type of accommodations. So it's a pretty decent amount of time. And it's got an English section and a reading section. So they're not together like the digital SAT is currently. There are two separate sections, the English and the reading. The math section, as well as a science section. Okay. That's probably one of the most significant differences between the SAT and the ACT is the addition of the science section. And the writing section is going to be optional. It's been optional for a while, and it's basically the option to, write an essay. And so the English section, they are two separate things. The English section is more so just kind of testing on grammar, multiple choice, things like that. And if a student were to take the writing section of the exam, that means now that the duration is 3 hours and 35 minutes. So again, very kind of a very long exam. And then this is really important to note that the ACT is accepted at all colleges that accept the SAT. So there's no preference between the two in admissions office, because I know when working with students, that's one of the biggest concerns is, well, I'm going to take the SAT because my student or my school that I'm applying to that I really, really want to go to prefers the ACT or prefers the SAT. They're going to be accepted. If the school accepts one, they're going to accept the other, which again is just a great tool when you're thinking about really having your student take an exam that is going to highlight their strengths. So it doesn't need to be, oh, well, the school is only going to take the SAT, and so I have to take the SAT, even though I'd be better at the ACT. It's not like that, thankfully. Admissions offices can compare the scores. There's a conversion chart. It's very easy to compare and see where students are at. In terms of timing for the, overall like changes to the exam, okay? This month, or not this month, excuse me, next month, is where we're going to see the digital testing, be available. It's going to be available on like the national testing days in September. All the students, whether they're testing on a Saturday, they're going to be able to, if you're testing on online format or on the paper exam, they'll be able to kind of benefit from these enhancements. We're going to go over specifically kind of what those enhancements are going to look like. If your student takes the exam in April, it will be, hey, you can take it online or you can just take the old paper test as is. So like the current format. And then eventually, once they kind of go through these changes, they do plan to offer both the paper-based and digital test, the enhanced version, simultaneously, which is, again, really nice when you consider your students having different options. Most students, because where everyone's got their school laptop or their computer, whatever, they're so used to technology, and they might feel more comfortable testing on a computer. Some students might feel more comfortable testing on paper. And so again, it's really just giving your student as many options as possible to really do their best on test day. Some of the previous issues that, I think really kind of have driven a lot of these changes to be made. In the past, there have been a fair amount of students who felt like the test was just too long. There wasn't enough time for a lot of the questions. The timing was actually one of the biggest differences between the ACT and the SAT. A lot of students wouldn't take the ACT because they had more time per question on the SAT. And that, in some cases I've seen, definitely was the sole determining factor of if they were taking the SAT and the ACT or the ACT. It doesn't help that they kind of sound the same there, but and also the idea of having to test in science, that can be really intimidating for a lot of students. Or if your students may be more like me and wanted to show off the skills in the science section, the ACT could have been a better fit. So yeah, these are just kind of some things that they really did hear from students. They tried to improve. Now, in terms of the actual changes that were made, okay, so there has been a reduction in the total number of questions. There's 44 fewer questions. The test duration, which was previously 195 minutes, is now being shortened to 125 minutes. So a little over 2 hours, more comparable to the digital SAT. There is more time per question now with the new format, which again is really key for a lot of students who felt like the former timing was just not enough. And there are reduced answer choices for math questions. So there's currently, if you were to take the paper ACT, there's currently 5 answer choices for the math questions. Now they're limiting it down to 4. Again, it's more similar to the digital SAT in that way as well, because there's 4 answer choices in math that you would be choosing from as well. One thing that is super helpful for students is that now, as we start transitioning to the digital test and beyond April, when we have these enhancements that will be available both digitally and on paper, students can opt to take the science section, or they don't have to take the science section. That's huge, because previously I would have recommended to my students, if a student came up to me and asked me, hey, I'm thinking about taking the SAT or the ACT, but I'm not really sure which one's going to be the best for me. What would you recommend? A lot of times it was just a simple, well, are you a STEM person or are you not a STEM person? Because if you don't particularly care for science, the ACT might not be the best bet for you, because there is that science section that you have to take. Now students have the option to take either one. So again, really just allowing them to customize this exam to highlight their strengths. So super, super happy about that. One thing that's important to note in terms of scoring. So because the science section is now going to be optional, students who do choose to take the science section, that science score is not going to be factored into the composite score. Okay, so the composite score is still just going to be based on the verbal topics and the math. It's not going to be factored in. The science score is not going to be factored into the composite score. It will be its own separate score, and it's still being offered in terms of like the actual scale of the ACT. It's going to be from a 1 to a 36. It's going to be that same exact scale for the composite as well as the science section. So you would have that separate score to be able to submit to colleges if you were looking at a STEM program or something like that. Okay. Now, the new ACT is not going to be adaptive like the digital test is. This also kind of makes sense when you think about it, especially for the tests that are going to be offered September and beyond, where students are going to be able to choose the enhanced test, but they can choose whether or not they want to take it digitally or on paper. Can't really do an adaptive test on paper. So it's not going to be adaptive like the SAT is. Okay. Now, In terms of some of the changes that students are going to need to be aware of as they start preparing for the new ACT, if they do choose to take it, students who are going to be testing digitally are going to need to get comfortable with that digital platform. I'm sure people do this, but I don't recommend, on test day is the first time that you're actually seeing what the digital interface is going to look like. I'm sure it happens, but that's not really my recommendation. I know for me, I always love to be able to highlight questions, and if I don't know how to highlight when I sit down and take the test, that could potentially kind of mess me up, for the exam. So you want to make sure that you are practicing and kind of getting comfortable with, okay, what is the screen going to look like when I'm taking test day? It sounds like it's something small, but it's not. You want to be comfortable with that on test day. You're already going to have kind of a stressful, it's test day, it's a little bit stressful, and you're just trying to focus on the questions and acing the material that you've got in front of you. And then now you have to deal with figuring out the interface as well and where all these buttons are. It's not ideal. So I would definitely recommend that people get just comfortable with that before test day. This is a huge thing too. There are going to be faster results that will be available. So it will be a lot easier for, if your student is going into their senior year and they're about to submit some applications, that's really helpful to know if you need to maybe look at retaking the exam as it comes back a little bit faster. Now you can kind of plan a little bit better for that. So that's a huge benefit for sure. And there again, fewer test sections is going to make things a little bit easier for students. It's also going to mean less test fatigue, more user-friendly experience. And a lot of the students are used to kind of working on the computer every day, and so it might just be a little bit easier for them to continue doing that rather than having to take the paper test. But definitely the test fatigue is going to be huge for the SAT or the ACT. It's why you kind of want to make sure that your students are regularly taking mock tests, because it's not enough, unfortunately, to just prepare for the content of the exam. The whole other ball game that you have to deal with is the fatigue. Sitting there for 2 hours, it doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're going through these kind of intense questions for the SAT or the ACT, that's a lot. Your brain's going through a lot, processing a lot, and it wears down. So making sure that you are regularly taking mock tests and kind of getting used to the amount of time and that endurance aspect of the exam is going to be a huge help. In terms of the future test dates specifically for the ACT, so the writing test, that essay at the end, that's going to remain optional on all test formats, whether it's paper, digital, whatever. For the April, June, and July tests that are upcoming, the science section will be optional, but only for those online tests. So if your student is scheduled to take an exam at their school, not on a Saturday, or if they're already registered to take the paper exam, etc., the science portion will not be optional. It will not be optional in the paper exam until September of this year. Okay, so it's a little bit different. They're not kind of making these changes all at once. So it's just a little bit of an FYI there. And as you can see, I mentioned that it seems a little bit like a menu with the ACT. It kind of is, especially with the differences in what's available now versus what's going to be available later this year. And depending on the, grade of your student currently, like that could have some impacts for sure. So for format options, again, we're going to have both available, but the enhancements themselves will be taking place later for the paper tests. And the new test, both the paper and the digital, it is going to be shorter than the current paper and the digital test. So it'll be a little bit nicer in terms of, timing there for students for sure. The content, and this was pretty much what happened with the SAT as well. The content is going to be pretty much the same. Their students are just going to have to really be able to navigate the digital format, but content wise, more or less is going to be the same from what we've seen on the ACT previously, what we're seeing now. And again, the same was true of the SAT when they transitioned from paper to digital. Content wise, in terms of what students need to know, what classes students really need to have completed in a perfect world before taking these exams, going to be the same. All right. Now I've thrown a lot of information at you guys in terms of, looking at the actual, the two exams and everything that's going to be offered. Now we kind of want to start thinking about comparing the tests. Overall they're standardized tests, but there are some pretty significant differences between them that you probably want to be aware of. SAT, full digital, been that way for a year. It is not offered in any paper format unless the student has accommodations and they need to be taking that exam on paper. But it's not an option. Students cannot choose to take the SAT on paper or digital. It's just digital unless they've got some type of accommodations that would, allow them to take the exam on paper. For the ACT, going forward, more so specifically, later this year, going to be offering both that digital and paper-based, and the paper-based will have the enhancements later this year as well. Okay. Timing, they're pretty comparable. I mean, a 9-minute time difference between the ACT and the SAT, not going to be really that big of a deal. So nothing really to worry there. They're very much similar in that regard. And then the structure, that I would argue is pretty different in a lot of ways, between the two exams, where again, the SAT is going to be adaptive. The biggest difference probably between the two in terms of structure is that the SAT is adaptive. The ACT will not be adaptive. It is not currently adaptive, and it will not transition to be adaptive. There are shorter reading passages with one question each. So that is something to note with the SAT. With the ACT, it's going to be a pretty much consistent question difficulty across sections. So in other words, it's not adaptive. We're going to see pretty much the same level of questions throughout. And the science section and the writing section are unique to the ACT. So if your student really wants to highlight either their science skills or their writing skills for, whatever programs they might be applying to, that's something to consider, and maybe could be one of the reasons why your student could end up choosing to take the ACT over the SAT. The SAT pretty much got rid of that essay right around the pandemic, and they kind of just never really went back. Now I will say, if your students are taking any type of AP English courses or anything like that, they do kind of say, okay, well, we probably know what their writing level is at. Plus, when you put in your personal essay and things like that, the colleges are still getting an idea of how your student is writing. So you don't necessarily need to go and sign up for the writing section if your student's going to be writing that personal statement and all of those secondary applications. They're still going to be getting an idea of how your student is as a writer without necessarily taking that writing section test. So just FYI, because I know sometimes people will feel pressured of, I really want to highlight my writing skills. You don't necessarily have to take the ACT just for that. In terms of choosing the right test, if, again, especially with the test as it is currently, if your student feels really strong in geometry or in science, is interested in applying to a STEM program of any kind, it might be worth, just kind of looking into the ACT and seeing if your student can really test in those science and math sections and kind of show off those scores. It does include more geometry questions, and that is significant for the ACT, just to note that it does include more geometry questions throughout the exam. For the SAT, the geometry and trig domain is only about 15% of the question makeup, so it's pretty small in comparison. The ACT does test on it a little bit more. So if you know your student is stronger or weaker in geometry, that also could be something that would kind of be helpful to evaluate, just so they can continue to showcase their strengths. One thing I do want to highlight too is that both exams, the digital format for the SAT and the ACT, students will have access to Desmos for both. So don't have to worry about, oh no, am I going to have access to Desmos and the SAT and not the ACT? No, both will have access to Desmos. The only thing that's going to be a little bit different from a math standpoint is that the ACT does not and will not, even with the changes, it will not be providing a reference or a formula sheet. The SAT does. So that's another thing to kind of consider. Granted, the SAT reference sheet only includes some formulas that are needed for like area and volume. It is by no means inclusive anyway. So I wouldn't say, I wouldn't recommend making the decision on whether or not to test the ACT or the SAT based on that reference sheet, because you're going to need to know some formulas for the exam, regardless of which one that you take. Okay. Now in terms of the verbal aspect of it, I always focus on math first because I like math, but for the verbal aspect of it, we do have shorter, single question passages on the SAT. So if students are really good in that brief focused reading, that's perfect for them. That's great. And then the ACT does have a little bit of a longer reading section. So that is something to kind of just be cognizant of. But overall, if you were to look at the data, verbal students, if you've got a very strong verbal student, you tend to do well in either the SAT or the ACT in verbal. So, not huge differences there, although they are technically different in terms of the structure. Okay. Ultimately, when it comes to preparing for either one of these exams, again, you do want to make sure that students are practicing regularly with the interface so they get used to whether it's the ACT or the SAT. Make sure that they're used to that digital format, be familiar with the highlighting features, etc. Anything that's going to help them, make sure they can access Desmos on there. Although students usually are pretty quick to figure that one out. They do love their Desmos. But yeah. And then I think, for most of these, we pretty much already covered it. Now, I will say whether a student is going to be testing on paper for the ACT or digitally, whatever, do want to make sure that you are practicing with timed full length tests pretty regularly so that you are getting comfortable with not only the content, but also really how to prepare for the endurance aspect of that exam, because that is challenging for a lot of students. There are also going to be some upcoming mock test events. I know we do have our SAT boot camp that's going to be offered a little bit later in March. And then there are some SAT and ACT mock tests. So just kind of things to maybe keep on the calendar, just keep in mind when your students are kind of considering which test might be best for them. I would strongly recommend, if you're not 100% sure, maybe your student, you're like, well, I don't know. I mean, they're okay with STEM, and I don't think that there's really like a strong preference that they might have ACT or SAT. I would definitely recommend taking a mock test, because that can be one of the most helpful ways to see where is my student actually scoring. You might think that, hey, I think that they're going to do better on the ACT because they love geometry, and you get the scores back, you compare them, and you're like, oh no, my student really scored really well in the practice SAT instead. So maybe devote more time, energy, and effort into taking the SAT. So these mock tests can be super helpful just to evaluate where your students are, what's really going to highlight their strengths the most, because that's what's going to be most important as they're putting in those applications for college. And just to kind of keep these on your radar as well, these are the official test dates that are coming up for the SAT, all the way up until the August exam. And then for the ACT, those are going to be their offerings, which is one other difference I would say. Even though the SAT and the ACT are offered the same amount, of test days each year, they are offered different times, so that could be kind of helpful to know as well. The SAT does not have a July test. So if your student really wants to test in July, maybe they, for vacation reasons, or they have something that July is just the perfect test month for them, ACT offers the exam in July. So just the little things in terms of timing that can also help too. But yes, those are kind of some things just to look out for. And then Bernadette, if you want to take it over from here.
Sure, and then I'll share some questions that we had as well, that I did type some answers to, but I want to make sure we share them with everyone. Just the special that I wanted to share with you guys, for buy 10 hours, get 2 hours free. It's just running through this Friday, but a good chance to get started. You can get a solid 6 hours of verbal, 6 hours of math out of that, or you can do anything you want with it because our hours are transferable to all subjects. You can use them for college coaching, you can share them with siblings, you can do all sorts of things. You can use it as a review session to go over your results once you get them from an official test, things like that. And I did want to share, if you want to go to the next slide, Ashley. I did put in the chat the link for some of our SAT and ACT mock tests coming up, but I also put my email address in there for anybody who wants to reach out about the bundle. We're about to release the registration form for that, so that should be coming at the end of this week. So feel free to email me at bernadette@novastarprep.com if you want to just get that registration form the second it's ready. Because like Ashley said, it's one of the best ways to figure out where you stand on a test and to get a sense of which one is best for your student in a no harm, no foul, reduce stress kind of situation, and you're not paying almost $70 for it or anything like that, and blowing an official SAT test there on trying to figure out where you stand. So this is always a good way to figure it out. I also put in the chat that we do have a new ACT mock test this Saturday. So it is the full-blown new enhanced ACT. And so as much as I know as parents, we may not want to spring that to our child the night before or something like that they're taking a test first thing in the morning. We'll give you have today, tomorrow, Friday morning to let them know, just because this is a great opportunity. But of course, we have one in April as well. And you'll find that we have mock tests every single month. So that's just something to think about if you want them to give it a shot this Saturday. It would start at 9 a.m. and it's a chance for them to try it. They can make sure that, they can choose to not take the science section with us, just like it's the official one. So there's ways, it certainly will feel very similar, and it will be a nice way to figure out where you stand with the test. That does relate to another question that someone asked us about practice tests. Someone from the audience asked, will the ACT practice test be on Blue Book? And so I did say no, the Blue Book is just the SAT. So they are in direct competition with each other, so they don't share resources or anything like that. But they do have one on their website right now. It's not, I don't know, Ashley, if you've looked at it yet too, but it's not set up exactly like a traditional practice test.
No, yeah, I noticed the formatting was a little bit weird too, and I think that if I'm not mistaken, last I looked, it looked like they still had 5 options for math instead of 4.
Yeah, and I saw that too, and it was kind of like you could choose to take like this section and then this section, but it wasn't a full-blown practice test, it didn't feel like.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure they're constantly improving it, but you can take one with us if you'd like to. So feel free with those links and everything. But yes, otherwise, when you're looking for practice from the ACT, besides with us, it would be on the ACT official website. So that's where you're going to see practice questions, breakdown of why they're changing the test, all of the registration, things like that. And then I saw someone asked how long is the ACT science section in the new format, and I did see that it was 40 minutes. So you can expect to sit there a little bit longer if you choose to do the science section. And then of course, if you choose to do the writing as well, you're there a little bit longer too. So
Yes, for
um,
sure.
but yeah, I mean, the timing we did, we've used our practice tests, and we've gone through them, and it's set up the same way as the official test, where you do get a 5-minute break after every section on the ACT, so a little bit of time to breathe. So we're anxious to see how the first administration of that goes in April, and we'll be keeping our eyes on it the way that we did with the SAT unveiling itself last year. But for right now, this is what they've released, what we know, and our team has been working diligently on the ACT practice test. So please feel free to join us for that, but we'll continually be offering it. And as always, if there's a mock test date that just doesn't work for you, feel free to reach out to us. You can take it on your own without a proctor. I mean, Ashley, you can speak to this too. The platform is extremely user friendly. It's easy in
Yes.
mock test mode. It's very easy to take the test, and I think all of
Yeah.
our students today are very tech savvy, so usually not a problem.
Yeah, no, usually there are no issues with it. As long as they know, the only thing that comes up sometimes is if the math section looks like it's locked, it's not actually locked. It's just like the actual exam. You have to take the verbal part first and then go into the math. That's the only thing that does throw students off sometimes, but that's it. And that's just like the actual exam as well. So
Exactly. Exactly. And we have one more question here. Is there an equivalent of Test Innovators for the ACT? Yes, that is the platform, and it's just literally the other side of it, so to speak. So it's one side is the SAT side of their website. Then on the other side is the ACT. So we have our side there. So it would be very similar login experience. It just says my ACT practice instead of my SAT practice. So you can be all on one platform taking both tests. You just kind of have to flip over between the two tests themselves on it.
mhm.
And I think those are the last two questions that we had. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to ask us? I know we got a couple minutes here so that we could answer ahead of time. And I know some might come up as you think about it and you're trying to decide between tests, so certainly we can answer those questions after the fact. I did put my email address in the chat there for anyone who needs it, but you'll get a follow-up email from me with the link to the recording. And feel free to share it with other individuals that maybe couldn't attend tonight, but I'll send it to anyone who registered, certainly. Don't think any other questions. I know it's a lot of changes, and it feels more daunting than it is with this one. It's just like Ashley said, it's really just more choice
It
and
is.
not so much that they've like revamped it in such a way that it's going to be completely unfamiliar. I went to a webinar of theirs recently where they explained that the practice materials from the old test would still be relatively helpful right now, and that it's very, they just want to make it a little bit more streamlined. They understand that that first section on it was 75 questions long and quite daunting for students. So I think they caught up, and for all of time, the SAT and ACT have played this game. One of them changes, and then a year later, the next one changes, and then something else happens. And 2 years ago, ACT swore up and down they weren't going online, and here we are. So it's just the changes happen. Colleges are aware of them. So if your student is a rising senior and has a paper ACT result and might take a virtual result, colleges are aware, just like they were before, about the adaptive scores for SAT versus the paper scores. So I wouldn't be too worried, but don't see any other questions. Ashley, any final thoughts before we sign off?
The only other thing I'll say is that because, with the differences now with the ACT, it's this, I can't stress it enough, really, that this is really the main reason too why you want to make sure that your students ideally are taking a mock test of honestly for both exams, because now that they're getting rid of the science section, that makes the base of these exams that much more comparable. And so
Yeah.
if there is a little bit of an edge one way or the other, you want to be aware of that as early as possible in the test prep journey, because test prep is a journey. And you want to realize pretty quickly, all right, what's my student going to do the best in? So definitely make sure to take a mock test. just to see where they're at, especially now that they've made it a little bit more of an even playing field with the optional science section. That is my main recommendation.
Absolutely. And really good point. This is the first time that they've been on more of an
Mhm.
even playing field together, and it makes a huge difference. The STEM score can still be great for your kids, but it's not counting towards the composite. So it's a nice way for them to showcase those skills. But for another student to perhaps showcase something else with the science detracting from their score.
Mhm.
So really good point there, Ashley. All right. Well, I guess we don't have any other questions. I'll be sending everything to everyone who attended tonight. If you have other questions, just let us know. And thank you all and have a great night.
Have a good one,
Right.
guys.
All right, Ashley, have a good night yourself.
Thank you, you too.
All right. Bye-bye.